Firstly, thank you very much for sparing some time to listen to us. I have my colleague Dylan and Amy, both from Sporting Assets here. So we're going to try and go no longer than an hour, because an hour I think is still a long time for anyone to sit and focus, particularly on some of the detail and content that we're going to discuss today. But hopefully you'll find it a useful experience. It's also probably worth saying that I appreciate that the people on the call here will come into this at different levels. So some people may have already had an application perhaps submitted, may have been successful or unsuccessful, have detailed knowledge, and others maybe this is the first encounter or time that they've really spent looking at the community ownership fund. So there are lots and lots of resources that we'll share and we'll discuss in a moment. So if it's hard to follow, we've got the chat box, but also bear in mind that there's lots more information that we can share afterwards. But we'll try and cover a sort of broad overview, and ultimately, hopefully at the end of it, you'll feel in a better place about how you can write a strong application for a sport or leisure project. Okay. So the outcomes, as I say today, really is to understand who the community ownership fund is for, the different support that's available, how the application will be assessed, and probably where we spend a lot of time in particular is approximately half of that assessment is on the management case. So we'll get into a lot of detail there, because it's proven to be an area that we've been told has probably been the most challenging for groups that have applied. So we want to provide as much time and space to talk about those aspects. Just a quick overview of the fund. As I say, some people might be aware of this. The Community Ownership Fund has been running for just over 2 years now, and it will run until March 2025. The fund itself is a £150 million fund. The successful awardees are always published on the government website. At last looking, there is roughly about £37 million has been invested in 150 projects. We are expecting some more announcements imminently on the latest window, but you can see that, you know, simple maths shows that we're kind of just over halfway into the fund, and it's certainly not spent half the money. So I suppose in that sense it's positive that, you know, there should be still plenty of opportunities for good applications to come forward that can get support. Okay. I'll cover a few slides to begin with, just to sort of cover the key headline points of the Community Ownership Fund. I think for anyone who's kind of not picked this up, I think it's really, really critical takeaway to remember the origins and what this fund is all about. So although clearly on the call today we're going to have a bit of a sport and leisure focus to the projects, the fund itself crosses all different sectors, rural communities, urban communities, pubs, shops, museums, you know, parks, green spaces, as well as sport and leisure facilities. But also, it's really important that any project to be successful has to, I suppose, ultimately start from a position where there's a valued community asset that's at risk. So it's critically important that kind of everything links back to that issue. Now, obviously, there's a variety of scenarios where an asset can be at risk, and some of those get a little bit subjective. Some of them are a lot clearer. It's very important that kind of throughout the process, that's not forgotten. And ultimately we need to keep going back to the asset itself and why it's at risk, because that's ultimately where this fund has come from, with the idea that that asset will be saved, or there'll be a long-term sustainable future for that asset under community ownership. So a few of the sort of scenarios you imagine, and I'm sure your own projects, you'll be able to see where you fit in. So it could be that it's at risk of being shut. It may already be closed. It could be up for sale by a private landlord, or a group potentially could be evicted. It could be that the asset is already owned by a community group and it's just derelict, or there's some essential repairs or renovations that need to happen for it to continue, or something that got brought in the last round was a kind of reflection that because the rising energy costs and energy inefficiency, it might just be that those costs themselves are kind of potentially crippling the long-term future of that asset. So as I say, they're just kind of broad headings. I'm sure there's combinations within those that you can see. You know, it could be that an asset has more than one, but we need to always remember that it comes from a position of risk. In terms of what's available, we're in round 3 now. There have been a few changes to this point. So from at the start of the year, the total that you could apply for increased. So at the start of the year, it was only sport and leisure projects that could apply for $1 million. That got changed in the last round. So now any project in theory could apply for up to $2 million. But it's very, very evident in the wording, in the assessment criteria, that it's certainly exceptional cases. So the expectation really is that groups will come in for up to 250K. And you kind of, if you average out, you know, there's 150 projects, roughly 37 million. It's just under 250K is the average award. So there is some detail again online about what an exceptional case is. Types of things that are mentioned are that an asset has greater profile than just its local community, perhaps. So maybe it's got some regional or even a greater kind of presence or importance. There's a kind of expectation that there'll be an enhanced strategic need, but also in terms of the management case, so there'll be more professional expertise involved. Other funding resources have been exhausted, etc. So it's not to say projects can't go for more, but it's important to recognise that there'll be a kind of greater ask in terms of the information and need. The amount of match funding has changed. That's come down in the last round. So historically it used to be a 50-50, and now it's been reduced down to 20%. So that obviously means that groups need to be able to show where they can provide 20% or more of a match for the total that they're applying for. The other thing that may or may not be clear to some groups is this opportunity for revenue funding, which I think is quite welcome. So that groups can apply for up to 50%, up to 50K revenue funding, and it's quite encouraged actually, because which could be for kind of year one, even working capital or extra, say, staffing costs to activate a site or turn it around. I think there's a recognition that, you know, that these assets have been struggling. So maybe there's a community group that come in fresh to take it on, and that they might need that extra support in year one. Or maybe the asset has been failing, and again, there needs to be some support, some extra revenue support and funding to make sure it gets off to a good start. So that's an opportunity, I think, that is worth considering, and that doesn't have to be matched in the same way the capital ask does. In terms of the application process, it's a two-stage process. As I say, some groups may have already submitted an expression of interest. Having worked on a few different funds, I'd say genuinely the first stage is very quick. Most funds say that, but it genuinely is. It's an online link from the government website or the My Community website. Series of questions, a lot of them are tick box questions. And yeah, it's something that should be able to do within an hour, I'd say. Some groups might even fly through that a bit quicker. If successful, I should say that the fund itself, I haven't mentioned this, is ultimately money from the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And they will ultimately make all the decisions on who receives the money. We'll go into this in a bit more detail later, but in the same way, they will decide which expressions of interest they're happy to invite to submit a full application. I'd say most groups have got, stand a good chance of getting through that first stage, unless there's a clear kind of issue with the criteria. Most groups will have an opportunity to submit a full application. And you'll receive a communication from the Department of Levelling Up Housing Communities with all that information. There's a few other changes that have happened that are worth highlighting. So there's 4 funding rounds a year. The current one, we're in round 2, and that closed, I think it's on October the 11th. Although they haven't published future dates for the windows, we know that there's a commitment for 4 a year. So you can kind of predict that every quarter, really, there'll be a new funding window. Yeah, definitely recommend making use of a Word version application form, which is on the My Community website. It's got all the application questions on it, and it just allows you to work up a draft offline with your groups. And it gives you something that, you know, that will be helpful as you get closer to the deadline, to make sure that you don't lose some of that work. Because as those have already applied, and as we go through this, you'll see there's a hell of a lot of information that's needed. So, yeah, it's the safest way, really, to make sure that isn't lost. Unsuccessful groups can reapply. And as I mentioned, the programme is open till March 2025. From the start of this year, a consortium has come in to provide some support to DLUC to help with the fund. And I think really primarily it's around to help generate pipeline to make sure there's more projects and good projects that are coming through, and also provide support to those groups in a range of different ways. So again, some groups may have already benefited from this. So there's a kind of contact point through My Community where people, you know, can actually talk to human beings about the project, whether it's eligible, the right time to apply, get some extra detail. There's webinars, best practice guides, which hopefully will make it more straightforward and easier to break through a lot of the detail which sits in, you know, the prospectus. The other main thing really to say here is that groups that have gone through the expression of interest stage may be able to receive some more dedicated in-depth support. So the groups that are listed here, and we're one of them, Supporting Assets, we all have our own different kind of specialties or sector specifics or area specific intelligence or knowledge. We're all typically anyway working on community-led projects. In our case, it's community-led sports projects. We might be able to provide in-depth support. We're able to kind of shortlist some projects. There's some criteria that we need to kind of be comfortable with around kind of leveling up. So a few different criteria there which allow us to shortlist. So things like projects in areas of deprivation, particularly diverse communities, and a couple of other metrics which around kind of community connectivity and activity. So if we're able to shortlist some of those groups, then there's a process, a diagnostic, and a few in-depth support days that can be set aside to really work with that group to help them and really look at where there might be some gaps in their project, support with the business plan and the application. So that's something that's come in from the start of this year and will run through the course of the programme now. And I've pretty much just covered what's on that slide. So I'd definitely recommend going to the My Community website if you haven't already. It's a lot easier, it's a better user interface than the government website, but it links to all the important pages on the government website. And as I say, you can speak to people, which is often the best way, and these in-depth support packages will be there for some of the groups. Okay, and we'll just go into a couple more slides. In fact, I don't know if there's been any questions.
Just one question, James. Where do you ask for this support, please? So it might just be worth highlighting just how people access the support you've just talked about. Yeah.
So the My Community website is the place to go, definitely, to begin with. So locality, Plunkett, and I think some of the regions are involved at that first stage. So they will, as I say, be available on the phone, pick up emails, queries. So they're kind of like the first line of to approach, really. So they're the top of the funnel. As I say, in terms of kind of in-depth support with the groups, that would then follow on from after expressions of interest have been submitted. And yeah, it's dependent. It's not a guarantee, but there's an opportunity for some groups to get that support. That said, a lot of the materials, things like business plan templates, this kind of stuff should be on the My Community website as well. So I think there's a recognition in bringing us on board that it is a detailed process, and that some groups ultimately need more help than others. So it's a way to try and prioritize some of the groups for support, and the ones that, as I say, we can't support all the groups, but as many resources as possible are put out there. So there's case studies, best practice guides. I see there's a couple of questions about that come in. There wasn't any support. Well, I suppose it depends how we kind of define the support. There should be someone that you can speak to on the phone immediately from My Community. So when the slides get shared after today, there'll be details about where to call. But I don't know if you could put in the chat box, Amy, the My Community website. You can log a query there. Yeah. Right. Okay. Okay. I think there's one more question that's come in. Is there about yeah, so getting through the expression of interest, does it mean acceptance of the assets at risk? As I say, we don't, the support providers, supporting assets being one of them, we don't assess expressions of interest or ultimately the applications. I think it's fair to say where we start to see the projects supporting assets, because we do a lot of the in-depth support, is the ones that pass through the expression of interest. I would say that there's a fairly low bar in terms of the amount of assessment that's done at first stage. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that. So there won't be detailed assessment on, is this really at risk? You know, is this group ready to take this on, etc., etc. All of that really follows in stage 2. So there may be a few points that are picked up by DLUC in that letter that might say, you know, make sure you know, if it's a local authority asset, make sure you're aware of this or that. But on the whole, there's not really much assessment for stage 1. And I appreciate that can cause a few issues in terms of expectation of being successful, but it's outside our control. And I think it is one of those things that it at least then kind of allows people to refocus. And sometimes it could be helpful to say to partners or colleagues, well, you know, we're in the process. But to be honest, the real work is in stage 2, which is, you know, why we're doing this webinar really, is to really get into the detail of what a good project looks like. So I'll just cover the headline stuff, and then Dylan will dive in more detail about some of the management case areas. What is good, as much as there's a lot of detail and there's a lot of work, is there is a lot of information published about ultimately the assessment criteria. So this is just a headline table. Again, through the My Community website, or you can go direct to the government website, you'll be able to see a detailed document on ultimately what the DLUC assessors will mark any projects on. Very broadly, it will be split into roughly 50-50, the strategic case and the management case. And those percentages are kind of made up by these subcategories, which have slightly different weightings, as you can see. So under strategic case, we'll cover these in a little bit more detail in a second, but we have current use, benefits, engagement and local support, and environmental sustainability. So you can see that engagement and local support, the weighting on that is double the current use. And likewise, the management case is split into sort of 4 sub areas, which we will cover in more detail now. Now, the key really is to make sure that you understand what those different assessment criteria marks mean. Ultimately, we don't have to get top marks in every area. We just need to get a minimum in some of those areas, and ultimately a minimum overall mark for the project to be successful. There is also the potential of sort of, well, there's more information for any successful projects that got through that stage about how any shortlisting might work, which again is something that is the responsibility of DLUC and the ministers, and that's outlined on the government website. But for now, what we really want to do is kind of delve into these, particularly the management case, so that you feel kind of most informed, best set to kind of put in a good application. So very quickly, just cover the strategic case and then spend the rest of the time on the management case. So strategic case, say it's broken into 4. So community use, And this will be, these will come out ultimately in terms of the application form, a few extra documents you submit, and primarily the business plan. So some of these questions will be almost directly asked in the application form, and some of these things you can include in the business plan as well. So community use, so who uses it currently, has used it in the past. So obviously we want to show that this is a genuine community asset, sports asset. It as I said, it might be something that's people using now but it's at risk. It might be something that has been used in the past, and we can still evidence why it's an important community asset even though it's closed. Obviously there's going to be different scenarios maybe around it, why it was shut, but it's really bringing out, like, if it's lost, how would it affect the community, and why ultimately are the community the best people to run this community asset. There's a whole bit on engagement and local support, particularly in the shaping of projects to this point. So if it's a campaign, how's the community been consulted, or future plans, how they be involved to this point. The more we can evidence and show, the better, whether it's town hall meetings, whether it's committee meetings, whether it's surveys, whether it's focus groups, conversations, whether it's letters of support as well. Almost as much as we can show, the better, and the various different methods. We want to also make sure that it's bedded in kind of research and evidence. So, as most people know, there's lots of information about the local area, what the demographics are, particularly from a sporting aspect. People will be familiar with documents like playing pitch strategies, local sport plans, these sort of things. If we can show why this asset is important beyond just us as a group saying, it's really important, and we can evidence the sort of lack of this type of facility maybe in the area, or other local policy documents or other partner documents or support, as much of that will make your application stronger. They're all quite interlinked, the strategic case ones, and typically sport projects can do well on these and will do well. So a lot of it will probably just be about evidencing it, putting the information across in a way that's really clear and easy and straightforward for someone to assess, making sure that you actually put it all out there. So, we've got to remember that the assessors are quite detached, and they might not understand sport or leisure. Certainly they won't understand it in the same way you do for your individual projects. So really lay it out. So what the benefits the project delivers. Can we put numbers to that in terms of not just people that are there, but anything else we can say about kind of social outcomes, this kind of thing. The more the better, really. And also, what obviously sometimes happens with sports projects, particularly kind of member clubs, is there's a lot of talk about how they benefit that sporting community, maybe particular sport, but we really need to try and show how the facility, let's say, is opened up to the wider community, or people beyond just that membership could benefit. And there's a section as well about environmental sustainability, which covers can cover a whole broad spectrum of things, really, in terms of the build itself, kind of like the green credentials of the build. It could be more around the kind of operational management, recycling, or other initiatives in terms of how the facility will be managed or has been managed in the past. So again, it's just kind of worth thinking about that in the whole, in the round. You know, so how the build itself is probably one thing, or the building itself, maybe it's an energy efficiency type project, maybe, you know, there'll be some changes within the build which will make it more energy efficient, but also the ongoing management. Again, as I say, there's a lot more detail for these. So when you go online, you'll see the assessment criteria. They will literally break it down as kind of what a satisfactory answer looks like, what a good answer looks like, and what a great answer looks like in each of these areas. So it's worth reflecting and looking at that. And I'll just do one final slide and I'll pass to Dylan. So where we wanted to spend more time, because I think it is probably, as we've heard from the DLUC assessors, this is where groups have probably fallen down more, is on the management case. So thinking back to that table I showed, the management case essentially breaks down into 4 sub areas, and there's marks attached to each. So we've got kind of funding breakdown, we've got financial and risk forecasts, resources and skills, and then representation, inclusiveness, and integration. And as we work through these next slides, we'll kind of look at what makes a strong application, the information, sort of things that the assessor might require or would help him make that decision, and that underlying information and documentation. So I will pass to Dylan, who will cover off firstly, I think, the funding breakdown.
Okay, thanks, James. Morning, everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to cover the financial elements of the application. So, and as James mentioned, that forms the management case for your project. We'll start with the capital costs. So that's either acquiring the asset or refurbishing the asset, and the match funding required to deliver your project. And then we'll jump into the financial forecast. So again, it's going to be important to demonstrate to DLUC that you can manage the project as a going concern. Okay, next slide. So in terms of acquiring the asset, if you're purchasing the asset, you will need to have an independent valuation. So you need to demonstrate to DLUC that what you're paying for the asset is reasonable. So an independent valuation is essential. You also need to have an agreement in terms of the sale or the transfer. So there may be a sale price or a transfer terms, but has the actual owner agreed to sell to you? So again, you need to evidence that in your application. It sounds obvious, but it is essential that you do that. If it's a community asset transfer, so that's where a local authority transfers an asset to a community organisation. Again, these can be quite slow, so you need to be able to give assurances to DLUC that you will be able to transfer the asset within the time frame. So you know, it's ensuring that you have your negotiations have progressed sufficiently in order to be able to demonstrate to DLUC that actually, yeah, you can actually deliver this project within the time frames required. You are required to deliver the project, and that means completing any building works and completing the spend of any award within 12 months of an award. So it's really important that you can demonstrate that you're very clear about the timescales for any acquisition. If it's as I said, if it's a community asset transfer, absolutely essential is evidence in writing from the local authority. So that could be a letter from the local authority. It could be a cabinet decision, for example, demonstrating that they are committed to that transfer. You may have progressed to heads of terms or draft lease, or indeed you may have executed the terms of those lease. Again, all those aspects need to be evidenced in your application to ensure that you can demonstrate to the assessor that, yeah, this project is progressing and it will progress within the timelines that are expected of you. And equally in terms of that as well is that you need to make sure that you're aware of any issues that might affect any acquisition. So that could be a covenant, for example, that needs to be negotiated away, or planning permission before you acquire the asset. Again, All these need to be fully explained and evidenced in your application. Okay, next slide. So your application should show, in terms of refurbishing the asset, your application should show what building works are required and needed in order for the building or the facility to be fit for purpose, or in order to bring it back in use. So the assessor will want to know that, as the applicant, you understand the condition of the building, you understand what's needed in order to bring it back in as fit for purpose, and that the funding is adequate to complete the works, i.e. that funding won't run out before the building work is complete. And a key part of that is that if you're making an application to the COF, you won't be able to go back in once they've made an award, and let's say there's a shortfall in funding. You can't go back into the community ownership fund for a top up in funding. So it's essential that you're aware of the costs of the works prior to making an application. And so, in order to do that, your application really needs to show a detailed breakdown of the works. You need to have it costed by a professional with professional advice, whether that's a QS or architect. It's really important that that appropriate professional advice is taken, just so that there is this firm grounding for the costs included in your application. And equally, you will also need to demonstrate, if your application, which most are, most applications will be over £25,000 in total project costs. So you need to go through a clear tender process as well in order to be able to demonstrate that you've gone through a transparent, open process for procuring those works. And as I said, COF needs to be spent within 12 months, and it's usually paid in arrears. So you need to be able to include a timescale for the building works. So again, and you need to be able to show that the order in which the works will be completed, and that you understand that, and you understand how long it will take, so that you can give assurances to DLUC that actually the works will be completed within that 12-month window. And then in terms of funding, breakdown of funding, the capital funding request is broken down into the cost of the acquisition and the cost of the refurbishment, or it could just simply be the cost of the refurbishment works, plus the contingency. And it's really important to build in sufficient contingency, ideally, again, based on professional advice. And again, we have seen applications that perhaps haven't included sufficient contingency, and then of course if there's and then may fall foul of those challenges later down the line. So it's really important that you've considered that. The revenue funding request, again, if you're including a revenue funding request in your application, again, it needs to be specific to the project. And you need to be clear about how you will use it and why you need the funding revenue request. So, for example, you can use a funding revenue request for the appointment of a project manager to manage the build of the works. And again, that gives assurances to DLUC that actually you've got a professional person that will manage that work, but also you're very clear about those costs, and you've included those in your funding applications. And then the total request of COF is the total capital request combined with the revenue request, and that's your request. That's your total request for funding. In terms of the total cost of the project, so the capital total project cost, you need to understand obviously the total project cost. You need to then minus the match funding, so that's both secured and secured, and that will give you the funding shortfall in terms of capital costs. So you can apply for funding, you can apply with unsecured funds. However, the more unsecured funds that you have, obviously, the weaker the case you have. So the more you can secure the funds, obviously, the stronger the case you can make to DLUC in order to make up the funding shortfall. And equally, if you have got unsecured funding and you're submitting with unsecured funding, you need to be absolutely clear about the timescales for decision on those on any unsecured funds, and it's built into your project plan. COF can provide up to 80% that make of match funding. So again, you can apply for up to 80%, but again, ideally you need to demonstrate that you exhausted other funds to make a strong case for your application. So in terms of strong application, yes, you need to provide full costings with clear explanations and ideally based on professional estimates. You've addressed any eligibility issues that were highlighted during your EOI stage. So James mentioned the expression of interest. With any letter, it often highlights any eligibility issues during those phases. So you'd need to address those by the time of your application. As I said, all match ideally secured or very certainly a clear route to securing any unsecured funds within the timeframes permitted. A project plan setting out the milestones to your spend profile. So again, demonstrating the project is spent within that 12 months of an award. And as I said, the revenue elements, you need to be clear as to the purpose of your revenue requests and how it will be included. And what's really important is that you include that in your business plan and your financial forecasts. I'm just conscious, James, we've had quite a few questions fly up as I was going through that. So is it worth us just pausing there and taking some questions?
I need to scroll to the top and read through them for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so first one that we had come through was, can the fund be used to build new facilities on an original site to make them more accessible and bespoke for disabled people, or does the facility already need to be built?
Are you taking this, James?
No, you go for it.
Okay. It's a great question, actually, because what you need to demonstrate for COF is actually the works are essential in order to safeguard the asset. An enhancement of the facility it can be a little tricky, obviously, because if your project is simply about enhancing an existing asset that is that is already going concern and in community use, then it will be very difficult, if you like, to demonstrate the risk value to your project. So providing you can demonstrate that any enhancement is essential to the viability of the project going forward, then yes, you can make a case. And absolutely any new works, whether that's refurbishment or enhancements, clearly needs to be DDA compliant. But equally, you need to go beyond that and actually need to ensure that you think about the accessibility in its broadest terms as well.
Okay, next question. Is there a term of lease minimum, say 25 years?
Yes, there is. So the lease terms, minimum term is ideally 15 years with reasonable break clauses. And also, what's really important to consider as well is that DLUC will take a charge on the property. So they would expect a 7-year charge, a charge on the property to remain on the property for 7 years.
Okay. Can you seek assistance for the purchase if you have already taken control of the assets this year?
Yes, absolutely. So, and again, there's no, it's an interesting one, because at what point do you determine that actually there's no period of time stated as to when you've taken acquisition of the property. So if you've executed the lease, certainly in the last 12 months, last 2 years, and you haven't found a solution to its long-term viability, then you still have a very strong case to come into COF for funds. If you've been managing a property perhaps for the last 10, 10 years, then I think the longer you've been in charge, I guess, in managing the property, the harder the case you can make in order to come into for funds. But again, it's about that risk, and it's about demonstrating that actually it's needed in order to safeguard the asset.
Okay. We have the site already, but the buildings are not fit for purpose, ex-farmhouse and extensions. Ideally, we would prefer to demolish the building and build a fit for purpose clubhouse. Does renovation or rebuild, is that problematic for application?
It comes down to the evidence in the application. So providing you can point to a feasibility study or a condition survey that has determined that the current asset is no longer fit for purpose, and actually the route, the most value for money route is actually to knock it down and start again, then yes, you can make a case. But it really comes back to, as I said, that feasibility or condition survey, independent survey that points to that case. If it's clearly an asset that can be refurbished and safeguarded, then that will be the expectation, would be about refurbing the asset and carrying out essential works as opposed to improvements.
Can you have a community asset transfer from any other body other than a local authority, e.g. Canal and River Trust?
Yeah, so there's no the transfer can be from a private from private, and then obviously you're securing that as a community into community ownership, or it could be from a local authority or any other body in that instance. What you need to demonstrate is that actually that you will secure the tenure, whether that's leasehold or freehold, within the timeframes of the application. So you need to clearly demonstrate that actually that transfer is in the interests of safeguarding the asset, but also can be that the terms of that transfer can be executed within the terms of the timeframe of the application.
I think maybe also worth adding that if it's a purchase, you may have seen that it's slightly different with local authorities. So private, a local authority can't register a capital receipt from a transfer. So but different, we've seen various different organizations, bodies, or private landlords groups being able to use COF for the purchase price for the transfer. So lots of different various ways they can be transferred, which is fine. But where a local authority is involved, it's worth just looking at a little bit more of the detail in the prospectus.
Okay. If the whole scheme is in phases, can the COF contribute to one phase, not all, given the 12-month spend profile?
The answer to that is yes, and obviously you just then are including details of that phase, but it's really important that you demonstrate that that it actually achieves the objective of safeguarding that asset, and that will be the risk in phasing any phased application. If it doesn't achieve that long-term sort of securing the asset, then that may not be sufficient in order to make the case for funding from COF.
And can COF be matched by other DLUC monies like Pound Deal or UK SPF?
James, have you?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of projects that have used match funding from other levelling up funds, and I've been told that that's fine. So I think it's worth with all the different funds just putting a call in. But yeah, I've seen it with other levelling up funds, so I wouldn't have thought that'd be an issue.
Okay. What about if you haven't owned it or leased it, but you were a volunteer staff member for an established time before the site was going to be sold? Is this still okay to try for help with the purchase, especially if you have big national organisations supporting you?
I'm not entirely sure if I follow the question, but yeah, if you haven't owned the asset, well, for starters, I probably ought to say you need to be an incorporated body in order to take on the asset, and by incorporated, you need to be essentially a not-for-profit or a community-owned incorporated body. Parish councils and town councils can also apply for the fund as well, and obviously if you're a charitable organisation as well, but you need to be a charitable incorporated body. So individuals can't secure any funding. It needs to be an incorporated body. And then if you haven't leased, or if you haven't secured the tenure, and the project's about securing the tenure, then yeah, absolutely, because it secures the facility in community ownership, and it would be about demonstrating the risk of not doing that would risk the long-term asset. I don't know if I've answered the question, but
yeah, it looks like the query is from a registered charity, and just another message on that one: does it strengthen the fund if you have national organisations backing you, or letters supporting you?
Yeah, without a doubt. So we briefly touched upon it, but James mentioned earlier around the community, community consultation and engagement is absolutely key, and part of that is letters of support, and not only engaging your local communities and your residents and getting them on board, but equally and particularly for the larger applications, that strategic support, letters of support from the MP, support from local councillors, and support from national bodies and organisations that can demonstrate the strategic case of your project is absolutely essential. Yes.
Okay, 2 more questions, I think.
Yeah.
So if we start work at our own costs, e.g. on urgent repairs, can this be counted as matched funding?
No. So any funds, any match funding that you've secured towards your project, you mustn't spend that until an award has been confirmed and you've agreed a funding profile or schedule with DLUC. Otherwise, it will be deemed retrospective funding and it can't count towards your project.
If we were successful, when does the 12-month clock start? And then another question that has just come in that links to that: what would happen if a grant awarded and then delivery slips? We all know what builders are like.
Yes. So the 12 months starts from the appoint of an award. So once you've secured an award, you'd have a manager, if you like, from DLUC that will manage that with you. So that 12 months, that clock starts there. And that's why it's really important to try and de-risk your project as much as possible at the point of application. But we also recognise, and DLUC recognise, that actually, there's certain elements of your project that would need to be may need to come after an award. So otherwise, if you're looking to procure the works, that can be quite costly and expensive, and naturally community groups want assurances that they've got the funding in place in order them to go out to the market and secure a contractor. So naturally, in those circumstances, you need to just build in a procurement, the appointment of the contractor, and the building works. For larger projects where the capital works go beyond 12 months, DLUC will work with those projects. They just want to ensure that actually the project is going to progress, and spend is going to progress within a reasonable period of time.
Maybe just take one more, because I think we've got a few slides.
Probably taking up my next presentations, but yeah, go on.
Yeah, carry on.
One more.
Okay, do you need to have full planning permission in place too?
So no, you don't have to have planning permission in place, but again, it comes back to that that risk. So planning permission in particular at the moment is taking quite a long time. And so that's that. If planning is required, then that's obviously a fundamental risk, and it risks that 12-month spend. So more often than not, we're seeing applications come forward with planning permission in place. However, it's not a requirement, but if you haven't got planning permission and you are required to have, then you need to clearly evidence and explain, how that aligns with your project plan in your application. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Right.
We might be able to come back.
So
yeah. Okay. So we're up to. Should we go on?
So I think we're on to the financials and the risk forecast. But I think that was really helpful, because I think there were a number of questions that came up there that naturally sort of alluded to those first elements really. But so obviously we understand the capital costs and we understand the project. What's really important then is that you can demonstrate to DLUC that actually you understand what's required to manage the project going forward. You have a very clear cost basis in terms of doing that. So you need to provide a revenue and a capital budget and a 5-year cash flow forecast for your project. So this is essential so that you can demonstrate that you have a sustainable, a viable plan, and it's based on realistic and deliverable proposals. So again, have you assessed the needs of your project? Do you understand the activities and services that you're going to offer? Have you got a very clear sort of business case for the project? So you need to ensure that you can generate enough income to cover your operational costs, but also to reinvest back into the asset, to cover any long-term costs, any sinking fund replacement costs. So that's really, really essential. So and evidencing that and having a clear set of assumptions is absolutely critical. So, have you got a feasibility? Have you carried out a feasibility study? That you understand the operational management obligations, the maintenance obligations on the facility. You understand what's required to safeguard that asset going forward, and you're very clear about your income sources and how you're going to generate the income for the asset. And that's very important. And equally, equally you understand the risks and you mitigate those risks. To ensure that again you can demonstrate to the assessors that you're very clear about what's expected. So in terms of detail, then COF will expect a 5-year cash flow forecast. So that's your annual income and expenditure forecast, plus a 12-month monthly forecast projection. And the 12-month projection should combine both the revenue project works, but also the capital works, because DLUC will want to see that you can adequately manage the capital spend, alongside any operational management obligations that you have at that time, to make sure that there's enough money in the budget that you can cover those costs, and obviously it's viable. You will need to include obviously detailed assumptions within that, and we'll come on to a little bit about that, and we'll give some examples about that. But you clearly need to demonstrate how have you reached the figures in your plan, and bearing in mind the assessor is looking at this in a cold form. They're just looking at the information you provided. They need to clearly see that the assumptions that you've reached in the financials, in your financial forecast, relate back to the business plan, relate back to the research, the information that you contained within your application. You need to include a sensitivity analysis. So again, that's really about dealing with what happens if the assumptions turn out to be incorrect. So income is lower than projected, or expenditure is higher than projected. So again, it's just modeling those aspects to ensure that yes, you can you can manage those risks. And again, a risk register. So it's essentially have a risk register that you considered all the risks, and that's not just the building risks. It's about the operational risks and the governance risks for your project as well. So you've considered them and you've mitigated those as well. And underpinning that as well is the detail that sits behind that. So you need to have a very clear operational plan. So the opening hours, the pricing policies, the staffing required to run the facility, whether that's volunteers or paid staff, that you've evidenced any market research that you've carried out. So you understand your target market, your customers, you evidence the consultation that you've carried out, and that's clear in terms of the assumptions you've reached. Again, that all needs to form part of your business plan and your financial forecasts. Okay, next slide. So this is the type of so in terms of the assumptions and the detail that's required, this slide showing an example, if you like, of the detail that you need to go to show actually how have you reached the figures in your financial forecast. So you need to be clear about the services and the activities you're going to deliver, and you can evidence how you can evidence very clearly how you've reached the figures. And equally, part of that, there may be areas, particularly when you're talking about activities and services and programming, there's going to be periods where you've got peak periods and off-peak periods. And again, some will have, you're going to have strong utilization during the peak period, and then obviously the assessor will want to ensure that you understand the sector, that you understand the market, that that you've been more prudent in those off-peak periods. So again, that will come in the business plan and demonstrating that in the business plan and your program of use. But the level of detail is really important so that you can demonstrate to the assessor that you understand your target market, you understand, you've made some realistic assumptions based on that real data, or based on your consultation, and you're confident that you as much as you can be in how you've reached how you've reached your business plan projections. And again, similarly then with the expenditure, so as much where you can base it on real data, whether that's quotations or industry standards, for example, then great, you need to state that in there. Where you're making assumptions, then you need to show how you've come to those conclusions again. So income and expenditure, they need to be clearly costed up. So so just in summary then, in terms of the financial and the risk forecast within your application, and essentially what's essential is that you provide a robust long-term business plan, outlining how you'll not only maximize the use of the facility in line with your stated objectives, but you clearly understand how you're going to generate the income, and that the income is sufficient to cover the operational cost, not only in terms of keeping the facility going, but also to keeping the facility in good condition. And again, pointing to those pointing to sort of evidence, or where you've got a feasibility study, or where you've carried out research, or your consultation, or you can point to industry standards or quotations. The more evidence you can show within your application, the better, because that gives that greater assurance to the assessor. And again, in terms of the risks, it's really important that you understand the risks associated with your project, and you have a clear plan of how you're going to manage and mitigate those risks. Right. So I think that covers most of the financial elements. I think we've picked up some of the queries in the questions. So Hopefully
Yeah.
that's been helpful.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Just to explain, we're kind of closing in. So Dylan's covered off in detail 2 of the 4 sort of sub areas of the management case, which, as you know, make up roughly half the assessment mark. So I'll just cover the final 2, and perhaps slightly less heavy, but yeah, we'll follow the same format. So the next one down really is skills and resources. So what they're looking for really is sort of relevant experience of delivering similar projects, and where we, bring this out, it is worth remembering that it may be that you don't have that experience on the team now. If it's a major capital project, we don't necessarily, I don't think, be like expecting that necessarily to be in the team. If it is there, great. Let's make sure we explain, bring that out. But if not, then how do we mitigate the fact that maybe people on board haven't been involved in a major capital build? So can we recruit people? Where would we recruit them? Or Dylan said, maybe we use the revenue grant to help pay for company or buying that expertise, and that extends really to all the different areas. So the project management expertise, and then the day-to-day management of the asset. So again, appreciate there's a lot of different starting positions here. So some groups may, have been running that asset for 5-10 years or longer anyway. So in some ways that's easier because hopefully, in terms of the operations, it's pretty clear, but still, let's make sure we explain what the key roles are, who the people are that are involved. But if it's a group that are taking on an asset for the first time, then still it's really important that DLUC understand that that you really do understand. Perhaps you can point to some other examples of visits you've had or groups that you've worked with to really understand the different roles required to run a facility of that nature. Need to bring out the governance and membership structures. We'll come on a little bit more in more detail about things like inclusivity and wider community input and ownership. So, but they need to be explained and understood. Again, I think although it's quite painful, it might be more work, the more we can explain any intricacies around governance and membership, if they exist. Things, particularly in sport, let's be honest, there's various little kind of niche elements about why, multi-sport type projects, why different groups need to be represented, or how governance structures evolve in the ways that they do. We just need to make sure they're explained and understood. So ultimately, you're not going to be marked down unfairly because the assessor doesn't quite understand and maybe doesn't understand the intricacies of a sort of multi-sport facility, for example, or involving different sections within a particular sport. Obviously detail on members of the board, their roles and responsibilities, and always think it's useful to have a section or explain the difference between kind of governing and operational positions and roles as well. So sort of breaking that down into actual stuff. So in terms of the governance board and structures, say table on what the roles are, experience of those board members. There's a lot in the prospectus about succession. Obviously that, there's a big part of this whole project is about long-term successful, sustainable community organizations. So, we need to be able to show what's going to happen beyond the individuals that are involved now. What how does the organisation typically deal with finding successors? You know, are there any plans in place? You know, examples that you can point to, all things that kind of hopefully de-risk the project from DLUC's perspective. Said before, experience of this type of project, whether that's the actual development aspect or the purchase aspect or the ongoing running of it, bringing that out and recognizing where there's maybe gaps and how they'll be addressed, whether we're, let's say, bringing different people in or maybe speaking to different groups that we're able to kind of mentor or learn from. Same with the operational team. If there are people already in place, or if they're not, how are we going to recruit them? And you know, there's quite a few projects that I've seen where there's maybe a shift or a kind of different role, perhaps, of the amount of volunteer involvement. Perhaps there's full-time roles that are being created, perhaps through the revenue funding. So it's just kind of understanding or making sure that DLUC understand that you understand what employing someone might look like, if that's something that you haven't done before. So just explaining, kind of making sure that you explain like how you see the duties, who will manage that person, and just, yeah, give that kind of comfort. And then, yeah, there's opportunities to add, obviously, more policies, procedures. Again, as I say, some groups might already have these in place. They're running facility. Maybe there's some policies and procedures that perhaps that are missing that you think would be good to add in. So risk management, maybe financial management, that kind of thing. At a governing level, conflict of interest, maybe safeguarding, these sort of things that, you know, it kind of worth thinking about all the different policies and procedures that, you know, you'd ordinarily like to see both at kind of governing and operational level. And there's no harm in including them and linking them perhaps in an appendix in the business plan. Obviously, you know, making sure that you're up to date with, if you're already incorporated and you've submitted annual returns, or if there's any kind of irregular things that might need explaining, then explain them. Maybe there's, I don't know, perhaps a lot of changes in the directors that you'll see on Companies House, or maybe there's been some late filing. Any of those issues, it's better to address them, explain them, than someone just kind of seeing it as a red flag without explanation. And yeah, as I said before, just making sure that you explain the different systems that you use or you might use. And, you know, it's all relative to the size of the project, of course. So, you know, the accounting system you have might be totally different to another group, because of, you know, the size of the turnover. But just explaining those, how things work, is all important. And, you know, these are things that you could maybe bring out in the risks document, for example. So in terms of skills and resources, really the strong application would have an awareness of the management requirements of the project, track record, or if proven skills, or if not, as I say, how those gaps will be addressed going forward. So it's the project itself, so maybe the transfer or the build, but then also the ongoing running of the community project, two slightly different things. So making sure that they're explained. As I said, explaining the governance structure is good. You know, it may be obvious to us, but it might not be to the assessor. So I always kind of like to think, you know, how a big decision is going to be made. you know, how people can be recruited, all these key areas. If we just add a line or two to explain it, just bring to life that governance structure, it's helpful. Say if the project, you know, if you're talking about bringing in someone in with some revenue funding, let's explain a bit, you know, maybe you could include a job description of that role, how you'd go about recruiting that person, you know, so that again, it's another thing that you can articulate and show that you understand well. Yeah, and just generally make sure there's consistency. So, you know, obviously, like who's mentioned on Companies House, the Charities Commission, the names match up, the website matches up, you know, the people that are mentioned in the business plan and the application, that they all, you know, it's quite clear and obvious who's involved. It's, yeah, it's amazing how often you can see kind of inconsistencies there. So then the final bit under the management case is representation, inclusiveness, and integration. So we talked a bit more at the start about the strategic case. That's a bit more about how the local, a good part of that is about engagement and how the project has been shaped. This is more about, you know, running it now. So how do the local community, you know, if we're saying that this is a vital community asset, like how ultimately do the local community get involved in running it? You know, and it's just explaining that. So it might be, yeah, you might have a democratically elected board, you might not, but you might, you know, you might have a completely different setup. But if so, then how can we, you know, we need to articulate kind of, you know, where might they be involved in the decision making? Is there maybe some more traditional kind of feedback mechanisms that users have where their views can be kind of heard and listened to? So it's a real important point, you know, particularly for sport, because as I say, you know, often a lot of the focus is on more of a, yeah, for some projects is on more of a club type culture. So it's just recognizing the wider usage and how people can be involved without changing the overall dynamic that's needed to govern, if that's the case. And yeah, sort of on that point, obviously making sure that at the bottom there that everyone is, you know, how it's accessible and inclusive to the whole community, and again evidencing maybe in the past what you've done, or activities or changes to the facilities that can prove that, you know, that is exactly how you like to operate. Some of the things that you could do to show that, so having a diversity, equity and inclusion policy, and then obviously kind of referencing that in the business plan or the application to show kind of how that's been applied rather than just the document itself. It would be good. Developing the plans to this point again. So this sort of links in really with a lot of the strategic case bit, but you know, that wider engagement to get to this point, so that, you know, it's a genuine community project. Referencing, evidencing anything you can say on that, it's great. Maybe put a table perhaps in the business plan, that kind of thing, to break down various different methods. Even they might seem quite small to you, that, you know, we had a few conversations with certain people, but I think the more you can say, the better. You know, break down all the different conversations, people that you've included to get to this point. There's no harm in adding a table or something to show that. We need to explain if there is a membership structure. There might not be, but kind of getting ourselves into the mind of the assessor. So what might they look at? You know, would they explaining maybe where there's any barriers to entry. So is there a potential barrier on cost or talent or any other reason, gender, whatever it might be? If there is, we need to explain it clearly, because DLAC will be looking at this in detail, and they'll want to make sure that the wider community is going to benefit from this work, and is included kind of in your governance, and the board itself, of course. So again, maybe there are changes that you've recognized that you need to do, and you're in the process of doing it, or you're going to do it, or maybe your board's absolutely fine as it is. Just explain that. Don't just submit something that might look like there's maybe a small number of people that aren't very reflective of the community making the decisions. If that's the case, I think it's worth reflecting and talking about how things might change, or how things will change, and the sort of pathway to doing that. So a strong application in this area would have lots of information and evidence attached to it on accountability. So say thinking through publishing minutes, or how big decisions are made, what consultation happens, those sort of examples are good to bring out. Looking forward to how the community will be involved in running the asset. What can we say on that? Maybe the board and the subgroups and committees or whatever they're all really well defined. There's terms of reference for those groups, and it's really clear, and we just need to attach those. Or maybe it's a new venture, and we need to just think about it. Think about, how would we do it? As I say, maybe it's surveys, maybe it's focus groups, maybe it's more formal involvement in the governance. But we need to show that in it, sort of once the operation's up and running, how the community continue to be involved. Address any barriers, and talk about kind of proactive things that you're planning or you've already done, and just general awareness really about the need to be inclusive. So again, these will come out in some of the application questions. There's the Word document on the My Community website. It's got all the questions that you'll be asked, so you can kind of prepare, start, drafting, and seeing where there might be gaps, things that might take a bit more time you might want to resolve before you apply. But a lot of this can also sit in the business plan, and that's kind of where we work with groups. We always say, a lot of this, if we look at the business plan often first, then we can build that up, and then writing the actual application should be a lot easier, because most of the information will already be in that business plan. So nearly done now. Here's just a quick example of a project that was funded, I think it was the back end of last year. So it's a riding centre. Just thought it'd be useful just to explain with those 4 key sort of management areas, sort of what they did well. So Margaret Hayes Riding Centre, I think, based near Bury. They've been going for quite a long time. The site that they were working from, it was a change in the covenant or something. The landlord suddenly wanted to sell. So the asset was at risk. It's historically been lots of value. They particularly deliver, I think they deliver programs particularly for young people, but also people with various disadvantage and disability. So yeah, it was very much an eligible project. It was at risk. It was an asset that was going on the market. So they got an independent valuation. They ultimately applied for 150k capital and a revenue grant as well. They managed to raise some partnership funding for a crowdfunding campaign and a benefactor as well. Obviously, the crowdfunding as well was another good example of how to show there was wider community support and engagement in the project. In terms of the financials and forecasts, as Dylan highlighted, they explained the assumptions well. The risks were clearly articulated, and the revenue grant was very much linked to this sort of first 12 months of activation. So on the whole project was about purchasing, securing the riding stables, but there was a little element of kind of development in the facility. I think they were looking to bring back into use a storage area which could be used more for a community room. So there was some extra kind of community activities, and they could ultimately host bigger groups and things which linked to increased revenue, and it was a key part of that revenue application that they could employ people part-time to really generate and activate that, generate revenue and activate that space. So they had a plan that could show, you know, this is what we're looking to do in that 12 months. So it made sense, and obviously linked to the fund objective of creating a long-term sustainable community business. So in terms of resources and skills, they obviously had a track record because they'd been running the centre already. They kind of explained the structure more, clarified those roles. As I say, I think they brought on at least one new person with the revenue grants. They could explain that process. And finally, in terms of representation, inclusiveness and integration, community involvement at all levels. You know, as I said, they were fortunate that it had already been a well-loved kind of community-run asset, but they did reach out. You know, they went further than just the normal users and riders. So they ran a big local community campaign. I think they're on the local news. They obviously did their crowdfunding campaign. They ended up putting on community events, like I think there's like theatre productions and other things, which took them outside of what they ordinarily would have done. So, you know, it's an asset that's used by a greater number of people in the local community than it was previously, I think it's fair to say. So yeah, it was more inclusive and accessible than it was before. So it's quite a simple but nice way perhaps to show how the different components come together. I think we've got a couple more slides summing up from Dylan, and then we can answer any final questions, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks, James. Yeah, so just points to bear in mind then. As I said earlier, I think DLUC cannot go back to applicants during the assessment process. I think they will include a 30-minute clarification call, but obviously there's only so much you can cover in that. So make sure you complete your application in full, and the more you can be in a ready position, you know, incorporated, you've secured the asset, you've got secured funding, the more you can demonstrate you're in a ready position to proceed with your application, the stronger your application is going to be. There are a limited number of attachments, so be aware of that. So make sure you complete the application in its full. There's a lot, you know, and familiarize yourself your application well before the submission deadline. Where possible, well, definitely make sure you back up your statements with evidence and show the research you've undertaken, the consultation you've undertaken that we've spoken about, and show that research so you can demonstrate your proposals are realistic. and make it easy for the assessor as well to find the information in your business plan and in your application. And probably the final thing for me, I would just say, would be, familiarize yourself with the assessment criteria and the scoring matrix, so that, again, you're clear about what DLUC are looking for. Next slide. Yeah, so avoiding problems. Projects can't be changed after submission. So if the project falls through or the building falls through, you can't use the COF funding, the award, to transfer to another building. It would be a brand new project. So obviously be aware of that. We mentioned earlier, you can't fund retrospectively, so don't spend any match funding prior to approval and permission to spend. DLUC will take a legal charge on the building. So as I said, it's a 7-year legal charge on the building, and just be familiar with the procurement rules. Appointing a professional person to actually undertake the procurement, certainly for larger scale projects, is probably the most appropriate route, really, to make sure you manage that effectively. And then final one for me really is just top tips. Do your research. Evidence the information in your application, as we've spoken about. Provide the explanations where needed. Really important is don't assume that the assessor understands your organisation or what you do, or even the sport or the industry. This fund is across a number of sectors, so make sure you provide the detail that's needed. And get someone else, if you can, to check your application, check for understanding and mistakes before you submit. I think they're the key tips, I guess.